Consider this before viewing Watergate Part 1. As you watch the program, think about why the Watergate scandal took place. How does it compare to other scandals in recent history? What attitudes and beliefs of the president and his staff led to the Watergate break-in and subsequent cover-up? What revelations led to President Nixon's resignation? Assignment Discovery now presents Watergate, Part 1.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. So help me God.
What we had really was sort of a civil war going on, and laws are inoperative in time of war.
The White House called it a third-rate burglary.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
But it would change the course of history.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency.
A White House in crisis.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
A president disgraced.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
A nation wounded. It's been 30 years since Watergate shocked the nation. Yet key questions about the scandal remain. Among them, the identity of Deep Throat, the elusive source who helped two young reporters crack the case.
It's probably the best secret in the world. I mean, the Cold War is over. We know everything about the Russians. They know pretty much everything about us. This secret is kept.
And the contents of the notorious 18.5-minute gap in one of Nixon's secret White House tapes. Today, new technology and new thinking are taking on Watergate's toughest riddles.
That tape will appear one day. The technology now exists to bring that back.
Can state-of-the-art science give voice to the most famous silence in recorded history? And in the hunt for Deep Throat, the list of suspects grows ever longer.
I've stacked the evidence high, wide, and deep.
Can a man who's profiled serial killers bring Deep Throat out of the shadows?
You can see anger in him. You can see fear.
What can the tools of forensic investigation tell us about Watergate and its legacy of secrets? It all started with a piece of tape. June 17th, 1972. 5 men wearing blue surgical gloves break into the Watergate office complex in Washington. Their mission? To wiretap, bug, and photograph files at the Democratic National Headquarters. Hours before the break-in was to start, one of the burglars tapes the latch to a door they'll be entering later. They believe the tape won't cause suspicion because Watergate cleanup crews routinely do the same thing while making their rounds. But by the time the burglars return after midnight, a security guard has removed the tape.
The guard did not call the police because the guard just figured out, there goes the cleanup crew again.
Gordon Liddy is running the operation. He orders the burglars to open the door, tape it again, and continue with the mission. A decision that would change history.
The cleanup crew had finished and gone home. I didn't know that, but the guard knew that. And when the guard saw the tape again, he said, wait a minute, the cleanup crew has gone home. That is a clue. And he called the police.
The break-in was carried out in the dark of night, but had its roots in the dark side of Richard Nixon's mind.
Always remember, others may hate you. Those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
Nixon, at that moment, realized, it's almost kind of a blinding insight, that it was hate that got him.
Richard Nixon was a complicated man in a turbulent time. When he became president, America was being torn apart by the war in Vietnam. Across the country, doves fought hawks. Hard hats battled demonstrators. Alone in the White House, President Nixon wrote notes to himself on yellow legal pads.
He would often stay up all night working with yellow pads, writing out, I must be good to do good. It was like New Year's resolution.
But while he cajoled himself to greatness, Richard Nixon also sought to punish his enemies, real and imagined, in the anti-war movement, people he scorned as traitors. A full 2 years before Watergate, he approved a plan to spy on Americans at home that included wiretaps, opening mail, and burglaries called black bag jobs. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI balked. The Bureau would not play ball.
Hoover had objected because this was all illegal activity, yet the president had approved it. I was fairly startled. I went over to see John Mitchell, the Attorney General, and told him my reaction. He said, well, you know, they like that stuff at the White House, John.
Over the course of his first term, President Nixon carved out a place in history as a statesman.
Generations in the years ahead will look back and thank us for this meeting that we have held.
The opening to China. Détente with the Soviets. But at home, he could not get past his anger at the anti-war movement, leaks, disloyalty, and the political opposition. And in the drive to win re-election, that meant a campaign of dirty tricks, sabotage, and political intelligence against the Democrats. The inexorable descent into Watergate was underway.
In that drive to win and destroy opponents, Richard Nixon had a head start because he believed those people were out to destroy him.
In what proved to be a fateful decision, the man put in charge of political espionage at the committee to re-elect the president was G. Gordon Liddy.
What we had really was sort of a civil war going on. And I had no problem at all with doing whatever is necessary, including breaking the law, because I think it was Cicero said, laws are inoperative in time of war.
In Attorney General John Mitchell's office at the Department of Justice, Liddy proposed an elaborate plan called Operation Gemstone, with each caper named for a different jewel.
We ran out of gemstones, we ran out of precious stones, and I think we actually got down to brick at one point, but those were the code names.
Operation Diamond was designed for the Republican Convention, where Liddy planned to kidnap demonstrators. Operation Sapphire was planned for the Democratic Convention. Liddy's team would hire prostitutes to lure Democrats into compromising situations on a lush houseboat that would be wired for sound. After hearing the proposals, the Attorney General told Liddy to come up with something more realistic. A scaled-down operation focusing on electronic surveillance was later approved, and Democratic headquarters at the Watergate was the target. The operation would be run by Howard Hunt at the White House and Gordon Liddy at the Committee to Re-elect.
It was, to me, very clearly just a fishing expedition. People really can't accept that it was as foolish and as stupid as it really was.
It was during the break-in on June 17th that simple piece of tape led to the greatest political scandal in American history. From the moment the 5 burglars were arrested, Watergate became a great detective story. At the Washington Post, the assignment to unravel it went to 2 young reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein.
The thing that was so extraordinary about Woodward and Bernstein is that they found out what was going on. And they did it quickly, and they did it cleanly, and they did it right.
Woodward and Bernstein got an early tip. An address book found on a burglar had a listing for Howard Hunt with an address listed at W House.
W House could have only been 2 kinds of houses, the White House or a whorehouse.
Woodward called the White House, reached Hunt, and asked why his name appeared in the address book.
He paused only momentarily and kind of shouted out, "Good God," and hung up. There was an I am packing my bags quality to his voice.
The next day, Woodward spoke to a well-placed government source, the man who would eventually be known to the nation as Deep Throat. He told Woodward that Hunt was definitely involved in the Watergate break-in. Deep Throat would help guide Woodward and Bernstein through months of unparalleled reporting, as they almost single-handedly kept the story alive.
They did keep attention on the story when nobody else was reporting it. It gave validity to the story, and that is the reason it ultimately started to unravel. It made it an important story that needed to be resolved.
Over the next 2 years, Watergate became a titanic struggle between the White House and the press.
I don't respect the type of journalism, the shabby journalism that is being practiced.
The White House and Congress.
Republicans do not cover up. Republicans do not go ahead and commit illegal acts.
The White House and the public. And then, in the summer of 1973, the nation learned of the president's secret tapes.
I was aware of listening devices.
When the White House revealed there was an 18.5-minute gap on one of the Watergate tapes, and demonstrated how the president's secretary, Rosemary Woods, might have erased it accidentally, there was an uproar.
Famous picture of Rose Woods, how you'd have to, what you'd have to do to go through to erase the tape and be on the phone or whatever. At the same time was, sort of like the 6-foot stretch.
It was called Rosemary's Boo Boo. The episode deeply wounded the president's credibility.
Made it all very dubious. It was the prelude to the smoking gun.
The fierce battle to force the president to hand over the tapes led to Watergate's endgame. When the president decided to fire the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, rather than release the tapes, the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, resigned, and his deputy was sacked. It was called the Saturday Night Massacre.
The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history.
The Supreme Court would finally resolve the issue of the tapes. In the case of the United States versus Richard Nixon, they unanimously ordered the president to hand them over.
Nixon lost political power because he betrayed his office, and people realized that.
And when the contents of the tape showed that the president was involved in the cover-up since the first days after the break-in, it was the smoking gun that no one could defend. Richard Nixon resigned on August 9th, 1974.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first.
A president who ordered political espionage against his opponents was ultimately undone by the secret recordings he ordered of himself.
As we now know from the tapes, Nixon wanted to, in a sense, run the presidency as an instrument of his personal revenge.
And as those tapes have been released through the years, they have constructed a portrait of his presidency that Richard Nixon could hardly have intended.
He installed the taping system because he really was concerned about how he would look in history's eyes. So he wanted to have the raw materials to construct a heroic portrait of his presidency when it came time to write his memoirs.
And the piece of tape that some think says the most about the Nixon presidency is the one with nothing on it, the 18.5-minute gap. Who erased the tape, and what was said? Some forensic audio experts believe they may soon have the answers. Listen carefully. This hum, this buzz, is a significant piece of American history, a missing piece, the 18.5-minute gap on Nixon White House tape 342. The famous gap is from a June 20th, 1972 conversation between Richard Nixon and his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, the very first White House recording of the president after the Watergate break-in. Because of Haldeman's notes from the meeting, we know the gap begins just as the discussion turned to Watergate. The notes describe the beginnings of a strategy, a counterattack, PR offensive, and hitting the opposition.
Haldeman's notes are the only recollection I have of what he told me. Haldeman was a very good note-taker. He was making the notes for my presidential files.
But Haldeman's sparse notes from this critical meeting have never satisfied the public's desire to learn exactly what was said during those 18.5 minutes. For 30 years, the tale of Tape 342 has tantalized historians. What caused the gap? What was said? Now the National Archives has embarked on a mission to try to recover the conversation that might be buried in the buzz. In state-of-the-art sound labs across the country, forensic audio experts are competing for the chance to do just that. Steve St. Croix of Intelligent Devices is a leading contender who believes modern technology is the key to uncovering the secrets of Tape 342.
I think now's the time. It could never, ever, ever have been done in the analog domain with analog equipment.
It's a high-tech twist in the dramatic 30-year search for answers about the gap.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
On July 16, 1973, the nation learned that President Nixon had secretly recorded his own conversations. It was a bombshell.
Something was disclosed this week that people will be talking about for years to come, and that's the fact that President Nixon bugged himself.
The tapes figured to be the evidence to prove Richard Nixon's innocence or destroy his presidency. Even the White House staff couldn't agree which it would be.
Half people in there thought, my God, it's going to show he's innocent. This is wonderful. We were celebrating. And the kids who came up from the streets knew better. They understood that side of life, and they said, this is it. It's over. We're done for.
Since the tapes were the president's private property, one aide said they should be burned on the White House lawn. But when Watergate investigators quickly issued subpoenas for the tapes, destroying them became a moot point. But beyond the legal argument, the president's attachment to his tapes ran deep.
He hated the idea of getting rid of those tapes. Those tapes were his life. They were going to be his history.
The disclosure that there was a mysterious gap on the first tape following the Watergate break-in created a political nightmare for the White House.
Clearly there was reason to believe that something was said on there that was extraordinarily damaging to the administration.
Explanations about the gap only made things worse. At first, the president's secretary, Rosemary Woods, stepped up to say the gap was her fault. A photo was released demonstrating how she might have accidentally pressed the record button while keeping her foot on a pedal that powered the tape deck. The image of Rosemary Woods stretched out like a gymnast stretched the limits of credibility. An independent panel of audio experts appointed by Watergate trial judge John Sirica determined the tape was deliberately erased by removing the microphone from a Ewer Universal tape deck and pressing the record button, not once, but at least 5 and perhaps as many as 9 times. The panel said the Nixon conversation was permanently wiped out, but erasing is a mechanical and imperfect process that some audio experts believe will always leave a shadow of what was recorded.
The great hope lies in not what was recorded, but the limitations of how it was erased. Every one of these limitations, and there were a lot of limitations back then, is to our benefit, because it means the erasure was done a little less completely, a little less thoroughly.
Recovering audio that can't be heard by a human ear seems an impossible dream.
This is audio in the time domain, audio in the frequency domain.
But with powerful new digital tools, it's happening every day.
We'll give you an idea of what computers can do that people don't think computers can do.
Here's an example of speech extraction software at work. This is a recording New York prosecutors gave to the forensic audio specialists at Intelligent Devices.
Here is the piece of audio we have to work with. So here we go. It's very loud. Watch out.
The software's algorithms filter out unwanted sounds and remarkably isolate and amplify audio frequencies it recognizes as a human voice. From useless noise to an understandable conversation.
Then we're going to take the car and go.
Before St. Croix or any other audio expert gets a chance at making history with tape 342, they'll have to first prove they can recover erased audio from a National Archives test tape that used original Nixon tape stock and recorders.
It's a very, very good and probably a quite fair representation of what we're going to be hit with.
Like tape 342 itself, the National Archives test tape is a combination of tones and useless noise. This is the painstaking process of looking and listening as the software removes unwanted frequencies and searches for a human voice.
The blue is generally the background, and these pink clouds are actually formant components of human voice. And you'll hear voice here, 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 and here on the pink areas, because those are human voice components. So here we go.
After just one pass of the software, there's the faintest hint of a human voice.
We're very surprised that we could definitely hear voice right away. So to hear it this soon and to have this much progress this early is very promising.
If Intelligent Devices is the company chosen by the National Archives to work on the Nixon tape, they say their approach will reinvent the wheel. Their first step will be to build a playback machine to convert the original single-track quarter-inch tape to a multiple-track digital signal.
This would be a playback machine that has many, many, many playback heads on it. Little tiny ones that read a very narrow piece of that stripe. And instead of one, put 150 or 200 or 250 of them.
Each one of those channels would be changed to computer data using converters with a dynamic range more sensitive than a human ear. It's an elaborate and costly plan, but until the National Archives picks a company for the project, it's still just a dream for this self-described audio geek. The mystery of tape 342 is an enduring part of Watergate's mythology.
I believe we stand more chance than not, above 50%, that we will be able to get into the tape as deep as we expect to. He could be ordering a pizza with pineapple. I don't know what it's going to be, but we've got to try.
Whatever was said, many Nixon watchers believe there's little doubt that it was the president himself, alone in the White House, who erased the tape. Historian Richard Reeves paints a picture of a solitary and anguished president, erasing 18.5 minutes of his treasured tapes.
Nixon was up all night. He was sitting there with a drink. He was trying to figure out what was on this tape and then figure out how to erase it. But everything I know about that White House is the only way it could have happened.
Now that you've seen Watergate Part 1, talk about this. Analyze the role of the press during political scandals such as Watergate. How did Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein uncover the Watergate story and keep it alive? Debate how reporters should balance respect for the role of the government with the public's right to know. Now try this. Research President Nixon's foreign policies with China and the Soviet Union. Compare Nixon's accomplishments with his failures and debate his overall success as president. For videos, CD-ROMs, lesson plans, and teacher resources on this topic and more, log on to discoveryschool.com. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests Watergate in American Memory by Michael Schutzen. Consider this before viewing Watergate Part 2. What do you know about the effects and consequences of Watergate? How did it affect President Nixon's place in history? How did it change the way Americans feel about their government? Think about why Watergate is still important to Americans. Assignment Discovery now presents Watergate, Part 2.
If the missing conversation on tape 342 can be recovered, one of Watergate's riddles may finally be solved. But the other great mystery of Watergate remains, the identity of Deep Throat. And here again, a new scientific approach may lead to an answer. Deep Throat is Watergate's mystery man, the secret source who lurked in the shadows, unforgettable and still unknown.
It's probably the best secret in the world. I mean, the Cold War is over. We know everything about the Russians. They know pretty much everything about us. This secret is kept.
His identity and even his motivation have been hidden for 30 years. But the vivid portrait of Deep Throat in the book All the President's Men helped create a legend painted in sketchy but tantalizing detail. Bob Woodward says Deep Throat held a sensitive position in the executive branch of the government and was his source before Watergate. But Deep Throat warned Woodward he could never be quoted, even anonymously. Deep Throat smoked cigarettes and drank scotch. He loved literature. His elaborate system for contacting and meeting Woodward after midnight in an underground garage had a secret agent's flair. The impact of Watergate and the success of All the President's Men turned Deep Throat into a cultural icon. But ironically, his role as a source has been greatly misunderstood. On more than one occasion, he fed Woodward and Bernstein bad information, and usually only offered guidance.
You tell me what you know, and I'll confirm. I'll keep you in the right direction if I can, but that's all.
The only part of the Deep Throat mystery that bothers me is the notion that Deep Throat gave us a huge amount of information and kind of dumped it in our laps.
Only Carl Bernstein, Bob Woodward, and Ben Bradley know who Deep Throat is. They say they'll reveal the name after he dies, but until then, they're not talking.
I haven't told a soul, and I'm not going to start today.
John Dean, who managed the Watergate cover-up day to day at the White House, thinks he knows who it is. But even after years of research, he's not prepared to make his choice public just yet.
I'd like to unravel it because I'd like to meet the guy who outranks me on Nixon's enemies list.
This is not Dean's first stab at naming Deep Throat. He once said it was Watergate prosecutor Earl Silbert, before deciding it was Alexander Haig. But he insists he's got it right this time.
Those of us who have some knowledge of the players and the first-hand information, it's sort of thing we just can't leave alone.
Naming Deep Throat suspects has long been an insider's game that's hard to follow without a scorecard. H.R. Haldeman said it was White House lawyer Fred Fielding. Senior Nixon advisor Leonard Garment was a popular suspect himself before he fingered political aide John Sears. The name game isn't limited to official Washington. On his deathbed, Nixon supporter Rabbi Baruch Korf said Deep Throat was Diane Sawyer. And this young man wasn't even alive during Watergate, but in a high school term paper, he said he learned Deep Throat's identity from an unusually well-placed source.
When I was 8 years old, I attended summer camp with the sons of Carl Bernstein, and during a day at the beach, I was told the identity by Jacob Bernstein. He said, Mark Felt is Deep Throat. He's someone in the FBI. I'm 100% sure.
Mark Felt has been a suspect from the start. Richard Nixon himself believed Felt was Deep Throat. But Carl Bernstein says his son was only parroting a theory of his ex-wife, novelist Nora Ephron.
The most important thing that we did to keep it a secret was not tell our wives of the moment.
Some of Woodward's colleagues at the Washington Post remember he had a secret source when he covered the FBI investigation into the shooting of presidential candidate George Wallace. They believe that source became Deep Throat. And since former FBI Director L. Patrick Gray's apartment building had an underground garage that looked like the one in All the President's Men, Gray became the source du jour. In trying to understand Deep Throat, every suspect has been pinned with a motive, from disloyalty to patriotism.
I think Deep Throat was a contemporary profile encouraged and feared that the Nixon White House was bringing down the very democratic values that are most important in our system.
Since Vietnam so dominated American politics before Watergate, the war could well have been the driving force behind Deep Throat.
My bet is it has something to do with the war. There was huge distrust between the military and the Nixon White House over the negotiations of the Vietnam War. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff put a spy in the White House to collect stuff.
Admiral Thomas Moorer was chairman of the Joint Chiefs during Watergate and has always denied that he ever spied on the White House. But the military motive and the chance that the Admiral and Woodward knew each other when Woodward was in the Navy make Moorer an intriguing Deep Throat candidate. Whoever it was, Deep Throat was plugged into the power and politics of Washington. He knew about the mood at the White House. This has led many of those on his trail to say Deep Throat must have been a White House staffer deeply troubled by Watergate. Someone like David Gergen.
David Gergen actually fits the bill to a T. He was a graduate of Yale, as was Woodward, so there was a possibility of a personal connection between them. He fits the political profile and the personality profile.
No matter how strong a case is built for any suspect, the hunt for Deep Throat has never produced a Perry Mason moment. No dramatic confession, just plenty of denials.
Look, I'm not Deep Throat. I was offered an awful lot of money, as were other people, when I left the White House to write the story of Deep Throat. And I said, I'll write a satire if you like, but I'm not the guy, so you're going to have to go elsewhere.
After 30 years of guesses and denials, historian Richard Reeves says this is one secret that's just too good to be true, and Deep Throat is probably a composite of several different sources.
Until the guys on the Jay Leno show saying I was Deep Throat, I'm not going to believe it. It's impossible to me that if there is such a person and such a phenomenon, that it hasn't surfaced.
But Woodward and Bernstein insist otherwise.
All the President's Men is completely accurate as we could make it, and the sources are as identified, and it's carefully done.
Serious investigations have always relied on that accuracy in their attempts to unmask Deep Throat. But now there's a new dimension to the search, the power of computer technology and the insights of forensic psychology. A red flag in a flower pot, a circle on page 20 of the New York Times, a taxi ride, a late-night walk in the nation's capital, a 2 a.m. rendezvous in an underground garage. These are the exotic elements of a secret meeting with Deep Throat. Meetings that helped Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein break the Watergate story. Now, another journalist is trying to uncover their secret source.
Find out last time that Deep Throat talked to Woodward.
For 3 years, journalism professor William Gaines and his students at the University of Illinois have been developing a database that now has more than 1,100 entries, cross-referencing the facts in all the President's Men and eliminating many of the usual suspects.
Like Henry Kissinger. He was in Paris signing the Vietnam Peace Agreement at one of the times in January of '73 when Deep Throat was meeting in the garage with Woodward.
Gaines and his students also reviewed copies of the FBI's 16,000-page Watergate investigation.
We want to print that out?
Absolutely.
And uncovered documents through the Freedom of Information Act. One important find, a Washington Post article about the mysterious gap in the Nixon tapes that cites White House sources. One of the quotes in the paper also appeared later in All the President's Men, this time attributed directly to Deep Throat. The students believe that's proof Deep Throat was a White House insider, so they're focusing their investigation on the President's staff.
They had to be in the White House continuously from May of 1972 until the last notation in All the President's Men We examined each and every name. We had 72 names of individuals.
One by one, Gaines and his students crossed names off their list. Different colors for people who died, started working at the White House too late, or left too early,
And Wallace H. Johnson.
or were out of town when Woodward met Deep Throat.
Does he qualify? Where does he fit into this?
From 72 names, the list now stands at 7. Presidential aides Stephen Bull and Jonathan Rose, White House lawyer Fred Fielding, press spokesman Gerald Warren, speechwriters David Gergen, Raymond Price, and Pat Buchanan. And the students have a hunch.
We all think we know.
We can all say it together, I think.
I don't know.
Buchanan.
Yeah.
We can also Buchanan. We all think Buchanan.
Pat Buchanan, an outspoken presidential candidate himself in recent years, is usually seen as a true blue Nixon loyalist. But Buchanan is a maverick, unpredictable, and the students say he matches the profile in all the president's men and was in a position to know what Deep Throat knew. His motive? The students say it was his bitter disillusionment over President Nixon's China policy. The students took the plunge, but the cautious professor isn't ready to name one of the White House 7 just yet.
This is the next part.
For Gaines, figuring out exactly when each of these White House aides had the information that Deep Throat gave to Woodward has proved a daunting task. That's exactly why John Dean, the self-described desk officer of the Watergate cover-up, believes he has the inside track on naming Deep Throat.
I knew how the investigation was unfolding. I knew who in the White House, who in the re-election committee, who in the FBI, who in the Department of Justice. I knew what they knew.
John Dean has tracked Deep Throat for more than 20 years and has taken a keen interest in William Gaines and his investigation.
We were going along parallel tracks, and they did a dandy job. I mean, they came down to a very narrow group.
Both John Dean and the students came up with some secret sources of their own, who gave them a copy of an early manuscript of all the president's men with notes in the margins.
That gave me some clues and some insights you can't get from just reading the book. After I sat back and looked at the profile, I said, this really only points to one person.
Some of the clues are familiar, but nuances in the manuscript about a man with a 5 o'clock shadow and someone who wore his emotions on his sleeve filled out the portrait for John Dean.
If you didn't know him, you wouldn't spot those kind of clues, or they would have no importance to you. So some of this information was uniquely resonant with me.
Dean says the portrait was so resonant he was ready to name White House aide Jonathan Rose. But Rose denies he was Deep Throat, maintains he never had any conversations with Woodward, and even threatened a lawsuit. And Dean says he now has a source that confirms Rose is not Deep Throat. John Dean, William Gaines, and just about every Deep Throat buff base their searches on a common assumption, that Woodward and Bernstein are telling the truth. But we ask someone to join the hunt who refuses to deal in assumptions. Roger Depew is one of the nation's leading criminal profilers, a former chief of the FBI's renowned behavioral science unit. Depew combed through the clues in all the president's men, applying the techniques of forensic psychology to create a profile of Deep Throat.
There's a considerable amount of material. There were 9 face-to-face meetings reported. We're looking at psychological, technical, and operational components.
Woodward and Deep Throat went to incredible lengths to avoid being followed. Woodward took the back stairs, hailed one cab and then another before walking to the garage. But Deep Throat would come right to Woodward's apartment to check for their meeting signal, or even to mark Woodward's newspaper. For Depew, it's a curious contradiction of extreme caution on the one hand and risk-taking on the other.
It makes a great story, but operationally, it doesn't wash. It didn't happen that way. It would be too cumbersome.
Depew decided to discard descriptions about Deep Throat and focus on something that his training in psycholinguistics told him was more reliable: Deep Throat's own statements, quoted in the book by Woodward. Word by word, he started to build a case. When Deep Throat says FBI Director Patrick Gray went to the White House, instead of saying Gray came to the White House, Depew sees a clue that Deep Throat did not work inside the White House.
You don't build a case on one issue, but those are the kind of subconscious things that we do in language.
Depew looked for meaning in every sentence. He says Deep Throat speaks in a single, consistent voice throughout the book. And from just his own words, he's come up with a remarkably detailed profile. Depew says Deep Throat is approximately 55 years old, authoritative and rigid, educated but not aristocratic, and, perhaps most important of all, he believes Deep Throat did not work at the White House, but was a member of the investigative community Depew knows so well.
That would be very likely, that this person was employed by the FBI, and it would have to be a person in a sufficiently high position to have access to this information, and to also feel the kinds of things that Deep Throat feels here.
Depew says Deep Throat expresses feelings of anger and resentment. That's a description that could well fit former FBI Associate Director Mark Felt, a man who reportedly resented Richard Nixon for not promoting him to director after J. Edgar Hoover died, and who Nixon and others later suspected of being Deep Throat. Felt has denied being Deep Throat, as have all the suspects on William Gaines' list, except one, Pat Buchanan. Through his office, Buchanan said he was not interested in commenting. Those who have named Deep Throat know that their choices are not ironclad. And until Woodward, Bernstein, Bradley, or Deep Throat himself steps forward, the game will surely go on.
When he dies or releases us from the agreement, which he is not, people will say, ah, now I see.
Stay tuned.
From the moment he walked away from the presidency, Richard Nixon began one last campaign, a battle for his place in history.
People didn't think it was enough to admit mistakes, fine. If they want me to get down and grovel on the floor, no, never.
History has noted the many achievements of Richard Nixon, but his legacy will always be overshadowed by one word: Watergate.
This evening's the White House, the last time as President of the United States.
That a man like this could become president of the greatest democracy in the world is one of the great triumphs of will and intelligence. And then when he got there, would set about destroying himself. It's an extraordinary story, and Shakespeare isn't around to write it, so people like me try.
Richard Nixon was a leader whose potential for greatness was tragically betrayed by his own behavior.
I brought myself down. I gave them a sword, and they stuck it in, and they twisted it with relish. And I guess if I had been in their position, I'd have done the same thing.
Watergate grew out of a willingness to use the machinery of the federal government to, as one White House memo said, screw our political enemies. And the president kept a long list of enemies that read like a who's who in America.
He was obsessed with his enemies. He was obsessed with settling scores. He was obsessed with vengeance.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution.
Richard Nixon promised law and order, but gave us breaking and entering, wiretapping, forgery, slush funds, dirty tricks, perjury, and obstruction of justice. In the end, dozens would be found guilty of crimes. The president's own attorney general called it the White House horrors.
The man at the top must bear the responsibility. That responsibility, therefore, belongs here, in this office. I accept it.
It may seem like remote history for people too young to remember it, but even after 30 years, Watergate is deeply embedded in our culture and politics.
The legacy of Watergate is a shadow, just is like a knife into the heart of the presidents after Nixon.
To historians, it was an abuse of power that threatened the very heart of American democracy.
It was not a third-rate burglary. It was a breakdown in the checks and balances system that made the United States a great country.
But in the end, the system worked. American democracy prevailed, and Richard Nixon became the only man in history to resign the presidency.
It forced the resignation. A lot of people went to jail. You know, prices were paid. The legal system did work in the end. And I think it's really important for the next generation to understand this.
After Watergate, Americans felt empowered to hold government accountable, and a generation was inspired to join the ranks of enterprising reporters and editors who helped transform the role of journalism in America.
People think I'm a liberal, but if I had been a three-eyed Buddhist communist, I would have gone after that story. I am a newspaper man who was interested in trying to find the truth.
But it's the way Americans feel about their government that is surely Watergate's most enduring legacy. The days when Americans idolized their presidents have given way to a cynicism about government.
For most people who came of age during the 1970s, Watergate was the crucial political event. Before Watergate, 2/3 of Americans trusted Washington, but then after Watergate, 2/3 of Americans mistrusted Washington.
Since Richard Nixon resigned, presidential scandals have been labeled gates, like Iran-Contra-gate and Monica-gate. A series of legislative reforms designed to clean up government followed in Watergate's wake. But to many, Washington seems to be meaner, not cleaner, and the politics of personal destruction still defy easy solutions.
And will, to the best of my ability,
on his second inaugural, Richard Nixon wrote to his closest aides that his 4-year term would consist of exactly 1,461 days that could stand out as great days for America.
So help me God.
That promise and the days of Richard Nixon's presidency were ended by Watergate.
It was the saddest thing, perhaps, in the history of the American presidency.
I let the American people down. And I have to carry that burden with me for the rest of my life. My political life is over.
Watergate ended Richard Nixon's political life. It tested American democracy and changed the nation's view of itself. What began with a simple piece of tape became an unforgettable chapter in the nation's history.
Keep watching. Discussion topics and activity and resources for Watergate Part 2 are up next on Assignment Discovery. Now that you've seen Watergate Part 2, talk about this. The identity of Deep Throat remains a mystery. Discuss the responsibility of journalists to protect their sources. Which techniques being used to identify Deep Throat seem most likely to reveal his identity? Now, try this. Read Woodward and Bernstein's All the President's Men, or watch the film starring Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. Write a book or film review. For videos, CD-ROMs, lesson plans, and teacher resources on this topic and more, log on to discoveryschool.com. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests In Search of Deep Throat, the greatest political mystery of our time, by Leonard Garman.